Chuck Norris passed away on March 19th, 2026, at the age of 86. The announcement came quietly. There were no dramatic headlines, no extended explanations. His family simply confirmed that he died peacefully, surrounded by those closest to him. No cause of death was disclosed. No final detail was offered to close the story. And under normal circumstances, that would be enough. A life reaches its end. A name slowly fades into memory. A story finds its natural conclusion. But this time, something feels different. Not suspicious, not uncertain, just incomplete. As if something is missing, as if the ending doesn't quite land where it should. Because this death, in a strange way, doesn't feel like an ending. Perhaps it's because long before this moment, the name Chuck Norris had already begun to drift away from the man himself. It became an image, then a symbol, a version of reality that was simplified, sharpened, and repeated until it no longer needed context. A man who never loses, never weakens, never breaks. An idea that is easy to recognize, easy to remember, and seemingly impossible to erase. So when the news arrived that he was gone, it created a quiet contradiction. The man may have reached the end of his life, but the thing he became does not seem capable of ending. The body can stop, but the image continues. And perhaps the most unsettling part is not that he has died, but that the world had already separated him from himself long before this moment, turning him into something that no longer depends on his existence to survive. If that is true, then the question is no longer about how he died. It becomes something else entirely. When did Chuck Norris stop being a man and become something more? Chuck Norris was not born into anything that resembled a legend. He was born on March 10th, 1940, in Ryan, Oklahoma, a small, quiet town far removed from the idea of Hollywood, fame, or mythology. His birth name was Carlos Ray Norris. There was nothing in that beginning that suggested scale, impact, or destiny. Just another child entering the world without expectation. His parents were Wilma Scarberry and Ray D. Norris. His mother was known for her strength and resilience, a steady presence in a life that would often feel unstable. His father, however, struggled with alcoholism and was largely absent, not only physically but emotionally. And in that absence, something important was missing. Not just guidance, but a sense of direction. The family moved frequently, never quite settling, never building a lasting sense of home. Stability was not something he grew up with. And for a child, that kind of environment does not create confidence. It creates uncertainty. As a boy, he was shy, quiet, lacking self-assurance. Not the kind of child who naturally takes space in a room. He did not stand out in school. He was not physically imposing. He was not charismatic. He was not what people would describe as a natural hero. If anything, he blended into the background. And that detail matters more than anything else. Because nothing in those early years suggested what the world would later believe about him. There was no trace of the man who never loses, no sign of the figure who would become untouchable, simplified into an image of strength that seemed almost beyond reality. Just a boy, trying to understand himself in a world that did not notice him. But sometimes, what defines a person is not what they are given, but what they are missing. There was no inherited strength to rely on, no identity already formed, no clear path waiting ahead, only a quiet beginning shaped by absence. And in that absence, something slowly took form. Not talent, not destiny, but the need to build something that wasn't there. Because before the discipline, before the image, before the myth, there was only a boy with no sign of becoming one. And that is where the contrast begins. If his childhood was defined by absence, then the next phase of Chuck Norris's life was defined by structure. Not purpose, not vision, just structure. At the age of 18, he joined the United States Air Force. It was not a dramatic turning point at the time, not a moment that felt like destiny. It was simply a step forward, a way out of uncertainty, a place where expectations were clear and rules were fixed. For someone who had grown up without direction, that alone mattered. He was stationed in South Korea, and it was there, far from home, that something quietly began to take shape. Not fame, not identity, but discipline. He was introduced to martial arts, specifically Tang Soo Do and later karate. At first, it wasn't about mastery or ambition. It was about repetition, movement, control, a system that demanded consistency, not brilliance. And that distinction is important. Because he was not a natural. There was no immediate spark of talent that set him apart from everyone else. No effortless dominance. No sense that he had discovered something he was born to do. What he had instead was patience. He trained, he repeated, he refined, over and over again, not chasing recognition, but building control. Not trying to impress, but trying to understand his own limitations and then slowly push past them. In a way, martial arts gave him something he had never had before. A mirror, a place where progress was measurable, where effort translated into change, where identity was not something you were given, but something you constructed, piece by piece. And for the first time in his life, he began to feel that construction happening. Not suddenly, and not dramatically, but steadily. The movements became sharper, the body more controlled, the mind more focused. And with that, something else emerged. Not confidence in the traditional sense, but a quiet sense of certainty. That he could shape himself, that he was not fixed, that who he was still in progress. Before the films, before the championships, before the image the world would come to recognize, there was this phase, unseen, repetitive, almost invisible, but essential. Because before he became a symbol of strength, he was a man learning how to build strength from nothing, not through talent, but through discipline. And long before the world would simplify him into something effortless, he was someone who had to earn every piece of who he would become. Chuck Norris did not arrive in the public eye through spectacle. He arrived through proof. By the late 1960s, after years of repetition and control, that quiet discipline began to produce visible results. He entered the world of competitive martial arts, and this time, the outcome was different. He didn't just participate, he won, again and again. He became a multiple-time karate champion, facing some of the best fighters of his era and consistently coming out on top. His style was not flashy, it was precise, efficient, controlled. There was no wasted movement. No excess expression, and slowly, a pattern began to form. A man who does not lose, a man who does not break, a man who does not speak more than necessary. For the first time, the outside world began to see something that could be defined, but it was still grounded in reality, just still connected to effort, still human. That changed in 1972. When he appeared alongside Bruce Lee in Way of the Dragon, the role was simple. He played the opponent, the final challenge. The man standing across from Bruce Lee in one of the most iconic fight scenes in martial arts cinema. There was very little dialogue, no emotional complexity, no layered character arc, just presence, physical, silent, unyielding. And somehow, that simplicity worked in his favor. Because on screen, something shifted. The discipline he had built over years was no longer just functional. It became visual. His body, his posture, his stillness. All of it translated into an image that audiences could immediately understand. Strength, control, resistance. Not as something explained, but as something seen. And that is where the transformation truly begins. Because once an audience can recognize you without explanation, something changes. The complexity of who you are starts to compress into something simpler, easier to remember, easier to repeat. The man becomes the image, and the image begins to take on a life of its own. From that point forward, the roles that followed would continue in that direction. Fewer words, more certainty, less doubt, a presence that did not need to justify itself. And slowly, without a clear moment of decision, the real person began to step back, not disappearing, but being replaced. Replaced by something cleaner, stronger, more consistent, a version of himself that did not carry hesitation or weakness or contradiction. And from there, the trajectory becomes almost inevitable. Because once the body becomes the image no longer needs the man to explain it. By the 1980s, Chuck Norris was no longer just a martial artist who had crossed into film. He had become something more defined, more consistent, more recognizable. And that consistency was the key. In films like Missing in Action and The Delta Force, his presence followed a pattern that audiences quickly learned to trust. The situations changed. War zones, rescue missions, impossible odds. But the outcome did not. He would endure. He would respond. He would win. There was no ambiguity in his roles, no moral uncertainty, no visible hesitation. The characters he played were not designed to be questioned. They were designed to be understood immediately. Strong, decisive, unshakable. And that clarity made him powerful on screen. Because the audience did not have to interpret him. They did not have to analyze his motives or wonder about his limits. Everything was already defined. Every movement, every decision, every outcome aligned with a single idea. He does not lose. As the decade progressed, that idea became more than just a cinematic pattern. It became expectation. And expectation over time becomes identity. Not the identity of the man himself, but the identity of the image. This transformation reached an even wider audience through television, with Walker, Texas Ranger. Week after week, the structure remained the same. A problem appears, chaos rises, and then, inevitably, it is resolved. Not through luck, not through chance, but through control. And once again, the audience saw what they had already come to expect. A man who is always right, always capable, always in command of the situation. There was comfort in that repetition, but there was also a consequence. Because the more consistent the image became, the less space remained for anything else. No weakness, no contradiction, no uncertainty. Only a version of a man that could be easily recognized, easily remembered, and easily repeated. And that is where the shift completes itself. The public no longer sees a person with a past, with complexity, with limits. They see a version, a simplified form, a distilled identity, something that can be understood in seconds, something that does not need explanation. And once that happens, the distance between the real person and the image becomes almost impossible to measure. Because the man still exists, but what the world sees is something much easier to believe in. For most public figures, the peak is easy to recognize, the fall even easier. But for Chuck Norris, what followed was neither dramatic nor sudden. It did not come with headlines, scandals, or visible collapse. It came quietly. As the 1990s gave way to a new era of Hollywood, the landscape began to shift. A different kind of action hero emerged, faster, louder, more stylized. The industry moved forward, as it always does, making space for new faces, new rhythms, new expectations. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, he was no longer at the center of it. There was no single moment that marked the transition, no final film that signaled an ending, just a gradual change in presence. Fewer appearances, less visibility, a softer connection to the mainstream. But what makes this phase unusual is what did not happen. There was no public breakdown, no scandal that redefined his image, no attempt to chase relevance at any cost. He did not resist the shift. He did not fight to remain in the spotlight. He simply stepped back. And in that decision, whether intentional or not, there is something revealing. Because many careers end in noise, in contradiction, in a struggle between who someone was and who they are becoming. This one did not. Instead, it slowed. The image that had once been so dominant, so clear, so consistent, did not shatter. It did not collapse under pressure. It simply stopped expanding, and in that stillness, something else began to take shape. Not disappearance, but distance. He was still there, still present, still recognizable, but no longer necessary to the moment. And that distinction matters. Because when someone fades without breaking, without redefining themselves through conflict, they leave behind something unusually intact. The image remains untouched, unchallenged, frozen in the form the world already understands. And perhaps that is why this phase feels so different. He did not lose relevance in a visible way. He did not fall. He became quiet. And in that quiet, the image stayed exactly as it was, unchanged, unquestioned, waiting. At some point in the early 2000s, something unusual happened to Chuck Norris. Not in Hollywood, not in martial arts, but somewhere else entirely. The internet arrived, not as a stage he stepped onto, but as a force that began to reshape him. It started quietly. Small jokes, short lines, shared between forums, message boards, early social media. There was no official launch, no campaign, no intention behind it that could be traced back to a single person. And yet, it spread. Chuck Norris doesn't sleep. He waits. Death once had a near Chuck Norris experience. At first, it felt like humor, exaggeration built on top of an already strong image, a playful extension of the man who never loses. But then something shifted. The jokes became a system. The system became a language. And the language became a global phenomenon. Millions of people, across different countries and cultures, began contributing to the same idea, expanding it, reshaping it, pushing it further away from reality with every iteration. And that is what makes this moment so different from everything that came before. Because this was not an image created by studios, not a persona shaped by directors, not a brand controlled by the man himself. This was something else, a version of him written collectively by the world. And in that process, the transformation accelerated. He was no longer just strong, he became impossible. No longer just resilient, he became untouchable. No longer just a man who wins, he became a figure that exists outside logic itself, a presence that could not be challenged, because the rules no longer applied. And once that boundary is crossed, something irreversible happens. The image detaches completely from the person, because no human being can sustain that level of perfection. No life can match that level of exaggeration. The version that now exists no longer needs to be real. It only needs to be believed. And for the first time in his life, the direction of that belief was no longer his to control. He did not choose this version of himself. He did not shape it. He did not define its limits. The world did. And the world kept going, pushing the image further, making it simpler, making it stronger, making it more absolute with every repetition, until eventually something remarkable became clear. The man was no longer at the center of his own identity. The idea was, and from that point forward, it no longer mattered what he did or didn't do, because the version of Chuck Norris that now existed could continue without him. And in a quiet, almost invisible way, that may have been the moment he outlived himself. On March 19th, 2026, Chuck Norris passed away in Hawaii at the age of 86. The statement was simple. He died peacefully, surrounded by his family. No cause of death was disclosed. There were no dramatic final details, no extended narrative to guide the public through the moment. Just a quiet confirmation that the man was gone. And in any other story, this would be the point where everything comes together. The life, the career, the image, all of it leading to a single, final conclusion. But here, something doesn't align. Because the moment the news spreads, the expected reaction doesn't fully arrive. There is recognition, there is respect, but there is also something else. A strange resistance to finality. As if the idea of him ending does not quite register in the same way. Because by this point, the separation has already happened. Long before 2026, long before the announcement. The internet had already taken the name Chuck Norris and transformed it into something that no longer depended on the man himself. A version that exists in repetition, in exaggeration, in collective imagination. A version that cannot age, cannot weaken, cannot die. So when the body stops, the symbol does not respond. It doesn't collapse. It doesn't disappear. It continues. The jokes are still there. The image is still intact. The idea remains untouched. And that creates a contrast that is difficult to resolve. Because on one side, there is a human life, finite, fragile, bound by time. A man who was born, who struggled, who built himself, who eventually reached an end like everyone else. And on the other side, there is something else entirely. A construct that was simplified, amplified, and repeated until it no longer behaves like reality. Something that was never meant to end. And perhaps the most important realization is this. This separation did not happen at the moment of death. It happened long before. The internet did not just celebrate him, it rewrote him. It took a real person, and turned him into a version that could exist independently of that person. So when the final moment came, the impact was divided. The man stopped, but the thing he had become had already moved beyond him. And in that sense, his death does not feel incomplete because something is missing. It feels incomplete because part of him was never there to begin with. When we look back at Chuck Norris, the first instinct might be to measure him in familiar ways. Was he the greatest actor of his generation? Was he the most complex figure in cinematic history? The answer, in both cases, is no. He was not defined by emotional range, not remembered for transformation from role to role, not studied for depth in the traditional sense. And yet, none of that seems to matter. Because what he became exists outside those categories. He is one of the very few individuals whose identity moved beyond performance and into something more abstract, an idea. Not just a man who appeared on screen, but a presence that could be recognized instantly, anywhere, without explanation. And that kind of transformation is rare. His legacy is not built on a single foundation, but on 3 layers that eventually converged. The first is real. Martial arts, discipline, years of repetition that turned him into a legitimate champion. Someone who earned his strength through effort, not illusion. The second is cinematic. Films and television that shaped a clear, consistent image. A man who does not lose, does not hesitate, does not break. A figure designed for clarity, not complexity. And the third is something entirely new. The internet. A space where that image was no longer controlled, no longer grounded, no longer limited by reality. A place where the idea of Chuck Norris could be rewritten, exaggerated, and expanded endlessly. And when those 3 layers overlap, something unusual happens. The person disappears into the pattern. Because what remains is not a biography, it is a concept. And that brings us back to the central question. When did he stop being a man and become something else? The answer is not a single moment, not a specific year. It is a process, a gradual reduction, where the image became simple enough to be understood instantly, strong enough to be remembered permanently, and flexible enough for the world to keep rewriting it. That is when the shift occurred. Not when he became famous, not when he became successful, but when he became repeatable. Because once the world can take your image and continue building on it without you, you are no longer just a person in history. You become part of something larger, something that does not need your presence to continue. And in that sense, he did not just leave behind a legacy, he became one. Chuck Norris did not begin as a symbol. He began as a boy, quiet, uncertain, growing up without direction, without confidence, without anything that suggested greatness, no sign of myth, no indication of permanence, just a life, waiting to take shape. Then came discipline, a young man in the Air Force, discovering structure where there had been none. Repetition, control, a slow, deliberate process of building something from the ground up, not talent, not destiny, but effort. From there, the transformation continued. A fighter who proved himself through competition, a presence that earned recognition, not through noise, but through consistency. And then, a shift. The camera arrives, the image forms, the roles become clearer, simpler, stronger. A man who does not lose, a figure who does not hesitate. And over time, And that image becomes easier to understand than the person behind it. From there, the process accelerates. The films repeat the pattern. The television reinforces it, until the man is no longer seen as an individual, but as a certainty. And then, something unexpected happens. The internet takes that certainty and removes it from reality entirely, expands it, distorts it, simplifies it even further until it no longer needs logic, context, or limitation. At that point, the transformation is complete. A boy becomes a man becomes an image, and the image becomes something else entirely, something that no longer belongs to him. And when the final moment comes, when the life itself reaches its end, what remains is not defined by what he did, or even by who he was. It is defined by what the world chose to keep. Because in the end, there are different ways to be remembered. Some are remembered for their actions, for their achievements, for the things they leave behind. But others are remembered for something less tangible, something imagined, something repeated, something believed. Some men are remembered for what they did. Others are remembered for what the world believes they could do. Chuck Norris was, in the simplest sense, a fighter, a man who learned discipline before identity, who built himself through repetition, through control, through quiet persistence. He became an actor, a presence on screen defined not by complexity, but by certainty. A figure audiences could recognize instantly, not because he changed, but because he remained the same. And then, something else happened. He became a symbol. Not one carefully designed, not one fully controlled, but one shaped by the world itself. Rewritten, repeated, and expanded until it no longer followed the limits of reality. A version of him that the internet would never allow to disappear. And that may be the final distinction. Because while the man had an ending, the idea did not. If you are drawn to the quiet truth behind legendary names, subscribe to Hollywood Biographies, where we explore not just fame, but what remains after it fades.